The air at 20,000 feet over Bremen was a frozen hell of shrapnel and fire. Inside the tail turret of B-17F Ticki Tavi, 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran flinched as another nearby explosion rocked the bomber, the sound of tearing metal competing with the deafening roar of the four engines. Outside his plexiglass dome, the sky was a grotesque tapestry. Black, cancerous blooms of flak burst all around the tight formation of flying fortresses, while sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s darted like angry hornets, their 20mm cannons spitting lethal fire. Moran, a farm boy from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, on his fifth mission, swept his twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns across the icy blue, his breath fogging the sights. His world had narrowed to this solitary, exposed bubble, a pressurized coffin at the very end of the aircraft. He was the eyes of the bomber's rear, but also its most vulnerable organ. The narrow, tube-like crawl space behind him was his only connection to the rest of the crew, a passage that felt impossibly distant as German fighters swarmed. A 109 streaked in from 6 o'clock low. Moran clenched the triggers, the violent vibration of the guns traveling up his arms, the scent of cordite cutting through the thin, oxygen-fed air. Tracers stitched toward the enemy, and he saw pieces fly off its wing before it peeled away, trailing smoke. A fleeting victory, swallowed instantly by the chaos. Then the intercom in his leather helmet crackled and died. A sudden, profound silence replaced the fragmented voices of his crew, the pilot's calm commands, the navigator's course corrections, the gunner's frantic calls. Through his shaking turret, Moran saw a sight that froze his blood. Ticki Tavi was no longer holding formation. His own bomber was sliding backwards, falling out of the protective herd like a wounded animal. Flak bursts walked closer, each concussion hammering the fuselage. A direct hit erupted amidships with a blinding flash. When the smoke cleared, the entire nose section, where the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator lived, was a mangled, burning wreck. Almost simultaneously, another shell tore through the radio compartment. The 9 men he had shared a nervous breakfast with hours earlier at RAF Snetterton Heath were gone, their fate sealed in an instant. He was utterly alone, the sole survivor in a mortally wounded aircraft still flying on its last shred of momentum. His training kicked in. Get out. With stiff, cold fingers, he unlocked the turret, rotated it to align with the fuselage, and crawled backwards into the narrow, dark tunnel. The plane groaned and shuddered around him. He reached for his parachute pack, clipped to the wall. His hands found not the smooth, firm silk pack, but a tattered, shredded mess. A 20mm cannon round or a piece of flak had found it. The harness straps were cut. The canopy inside was punctured in a dozen places. It was utterly useless. At that moment, the final cataclysmic hit struck. A deafening roar, a sensation of the world tearing in two, and Eugene Moran was no longer in a bomber. He was in free fall, still inside his metal prison, as the severed tail section of the B-17 began its long, spinning descent toward the German forest below, with him trapped inside.
The universe dissolved into a screaming, twisting vortex of noise and force. One moment, Eugene Moran was in the shattered remains of his bomber. The next, he was a passenger inside a metal projectile hurtling through the sky. The initial sensation was not of falling, but of being violently spun by a giant invisible hand. The severed tail section, a 13-foot-tall vertical stabilizer and 43-foot horizontal stabilizers still attached, tumbled through the thin, cold air. Moran was thrown brutally against the metal frames of his gun mounts, his head smashing into the gun sight. Stars exploded in his vision, and warm blood immediately sheeted down his face from a gash in his scalp. The wind, howling through the jagged opening where the fuselage had been torn away, was a deafening roar that drowned all thought. The ground, a distant patchwork of fields and forests, pirouetted madly in his small windows, sky and earth swapping places in a nauseating blur. He was a bug in a violently shaken tin can, experiencing forces no pilot was ever meant to withstand. Instinctively, he gripped the handles of his twin .50 caliber Brownings, the only anchors in his disintegrating world. The altimeter on the wall, miraculously still intact, spun wildly before settling, 18,000 feet. He was descending, but not in the straight, deadly dive he expected. The massive tail surfaces, designed to provide stability, were now acting as crude, unguided wings. Then the chaos began to order itself. The wild tumbling slowed, transitioning into a steep, spiraling glide. The aerodynamic forces, acting on the large stabilizers, fought the pull of gravity, turning the freefall into a controlled, albeit rapid, descent. The section found an equilibrium, its nose-down attitude steadying as it auto-rotated in a wide, sickening corkscrew. The deafening wind became a constant, brutal shriek. Moran, fighting to clear the blood from his eyes, understood the impossible physics at play. He was gliding. The tail was no longer falling, it was flying, however crudely, its design betraying the very purpose of its destruction. This bizarre stability offered a moment of horrific clarity. He was alive, conscious, and trapped in a coffin that was navigating itself to an inevitable crash. Peering through his blood-smeared window, he saw them, two Messerschmitt Bf-109s, sliding into view like sharks, curious about a dying whale. They circled, likely confirming the kill, assuming nothing inside could have survived the disintegration. A primal, defiant rage cut through Moran's terror. He was not dead yet. With a strength born of sheer desperation, he hauled his aching body back into a firing position. His fingers, numb with cold, found the triggers. The electric firing mechanism still had power. As one of the fighters banked for a closer look, its black cross filling his view, Moran did the unthinkable. He took aim from his spiraling, falling fortress and squeezed the triggers. The guns, still loaded, roared to life. Tracers lanced out from the wreckage, arcing toward the astonished German pilot, who pulled away in a sharp, evasive climb. The severed tail of the Ticki Tavi was not just falling, it was fighting back.
The earth ceased to be a distant pattern and became a raging green wall rushing up to smash him. The tail section's strange spiraling glide was over. Gravity had won the final argument. Through a haze of pain and blood, Eugene Moran saw the pine trees of the forest outside the village of Geese, individual, sharp, and terrifyingly close. There was no control, no last-moment pull-up, only the inevitability of impact. He braced as best he could, tucking his head and locking his shattered arms around the gun mounts, a futile attempt to anchor himself against the coming oblivion. The world exploded in a symphony of destruction. The first impact was a massive, shuddering blow as the vertical stabilizer sheared through the upper branches of an 80-foot pine, the sound of splintering wood like cannon fire. The tail section cartwheeled, its aluminum skin tearing away in shrieking sheets. Moran was thrown like a rag doll against the hard metal interior, his already cracked ribs giving way with sickening crunches. The second impact, with the ground, drove the air from his lungs and his consciousness into a narrow, dark tunnel. A final violent jerk as the wreckage snagged on a massive trunk, and then an impossible, ringing silence. Consciousness returned in waves of pure, white-hot agony. Every breath was a knife in his chest. His arms were useless, twisted at unnatural angles.
His head felt split open, blood pooling in his ears and mouth. The coppery taste filled his senses. He was alive, but engulfed in a broken body, buried in a tomb of crumpled metal and the sharp, sweet smell of shattered pine. Daylight streamed through torn openings, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He heard voices then, cutting through the fog of pain. German voices. His heart, already pounding, seized with a new fear. Capture, interrogation, or a bullet in the woods. Boots crunched on debris. Figures blocked the light, leaning into the wreckage. But the faces that peered in were not the hardened visages of Wehrmacht soldiers or the cold efficiency of the Luftwaffe. They were gaunt, framed by matted hair and tattered civilian clothes stained with dirt. Their eyes held not hostility, but a profound, weary shock. They were prisoners. In broken German and through urgent gestures they communicated who they were. 2 Serbian doctors, captured years earlier and forced into slave labor. They had seen the tail section fall and ran to the crash expecting to pull out a corpse. Instead, they found a young man clinging to life by a thread. Without a word about the uniform he wore or the bombs his plane had dropped, they became his saviors. Working with frantic, expert hands amidst the wreckage, they gently extricated him, stabilized his head and neck with strips of torn cloth, and applied pressure to his worst wounds. In the shadow of the forest, the first people to reach the American tail gunner were not his enemies, but fellow victims of the same war, who chose to uphold their oath in hell.
The world became a blur of pain, foreign voices, and sterile odors. Transported from the forest floor to a German military hospital in Bremen, the very city he had been sent to destroy, Eugene Moran existed in a twilight state between life and death. German doctors, their faces grim and professional, examined his catalog of destruction: the depressed skull fracture, the compound fractures in both forearms, multiple broken ribs, and massive internal trauma. Their prognosis, conveyed in terse tones he didn't need to understand, was clear. This was not a patient to save, but a body to process. Resources were for their own wounded. Yet in the corner of the cold ward, his 2 Serbian guardians remained, a silent shield of defiance. Using their scant authority as medical personnel, they insisted on changing his dressings, monitoring his fading vitals, and spoon-feeding him watery broth. They became his interpreters, his advocates, and the only thread tethering him to consciousness. For days, Moran drifted in agonizing delirium, haunted by the spinning descent and the faces of his dead crew. His survival defied medical logic. It was a raw, stubborn assertion of will, quietly nurtured by the compassion of 2 men who owed him nothing. When his fever finally broke, he found himself not in a grave, but in a stark recovery room, his body a tapestry of bandages and splints. The first true test of his fortitude was about to begin, not from his injuries, but from the men who now owned him. The interrogators arrived as he was beginning to comprehend his surroundings. They were polite, almost clinical, but their eyes held a cold curiosity. They wanted tactical information: staff sergeant strength, new bomb sites, radio codes, target priorities for the 8th Air Force. Each question was a trap, wrapped in promises of better food, proper medical care, or vague threats of transfer to a far worse camp. Moran, his body screaming with every shallow breath, gave him the only answers he had memorized. Staff Sergeant Eugene P. Moran, 17085-539. Name, rank, serial number. The script was a lifeline. Frustration crept into his captors' voices. They switched tactics, describing the hopelessness of his situation, the certainty of Germany's ultimate victory, the futility of his silence. They showed him propaganda leaflets. They left him for days in isolation, with nothing but his pain and thoughts for company. He said nothing.
The defiance that had made him fire his guns from a falling tail section now turned inward, fortifying his spirit. After 2 weeks, the questions stopped. The door to his room opened, not to another officer, but to guards with transfer papers. He was loaded onto a truck with other captured airmen, his body still broken, but his spirit unbroken. The journey east was a new ordeal of jolting pain and cold. When the truck finally stopped and the rear gate dropped, Eugene Moran faced his new reality, the vast, bleak compound of Stalag Luft III. Beyond the barbed wire, he saw not just guards and barracks, but thousands of men like him, a silent army in captivity, waiting. His private battle for survival was over. He had just been conscripted into a collective one.
Stalag Luft III was a universe of gray. Gray barracks, gray uniforms, gray skies hanging low over the barbed wire fences. For Eugene Moran, arriving in the bitter December cold of 1943, the sprawling prisoner of war camp was both a reprieve and a new prison. The savage pain of his injuries had subsided into a constant dull ache. His arms, having healed without proper setting, were permanently twisted. Simple tasks were agonizing or impossible. Buttoning his threadbare tunic, tying his boots, holding a spoon, each was a humiliating struggle. Yet here, he was not alone. The culture of the camp, meticulously organized by the senior Allied officers, was one of shared defiance and survival. Seasoned prisoners took him in, helping him dress, sharing their meager Red Cross parcel contents and teaching him the unspoken rules. The German rations were a starvation diet: black bread made with sawdust, watery potato soup, the occasional rotten turnip. The single coal stove in each overcrowded barracks did little against the deep freeze of the Silesian winter. Moran adapted to the rhythm of roll calls, the constant hunger, and the mind-numbing boredom, broken only by clandestine activities. The greatest of these was the secret radio, painstakingly assembled from smuggled parts and hidden in a barrack's wall, which brought forbidden news from the BBC, whispering of Allied advances and fueling a fragile collective hope. That hope took its most ambitious physical form in the tunnels. For over a year, Moran learned, a dedicated team of prisoners had been orchestrating an escape of unprecedented scale right under the guards' noses. Codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, 3 tunnels were dug 30 feet below the compound to avoid detection by microphones. The work was excruciating and perilous, done with stolen cutlery and buckets, the sand dispersed secretly through trouser legs. While Moran's physical condition prevented him from digging, he bore witness to the tense electric atmosphere of preparation. The forging of papers, the crafting of civilian clothes, the meticulous planning. On the moonless night of March 24, 1944, Harry was finally ready. The word spread through the barracks like a current. Moran, like every prisoner, lay awake in the dark, holding his breath for the 76 men chosen to go. For hours, the only sound was the distant cough of a guard. By dawn, a stunning silence had descended. The escape had worked. But the elation was short-lived. Within days, the Nazis launched a massive manhunt. The camp waited in a state of suspended dread. When the news finally came, it was delivered with brutal finality by the German commandant himself. Of the 76 escapees, 73 had been recaptured, and on direct orders of Adolf Hitler, 50 of them, a grim, arbitrary number, had been executed. Their names were posted on the camp bulletin board. The vibrant, defiant spirit of Stalag Luft III was extinguished in an instant, replaced by a cold, silent fury and a profound grief. The message was clear. Survival was no longer about escape, but about endurance. The barbed wire had just grown taller, and the stakes of simply living through each day had become the ultimate act of defiance. The Russian artillery was a distant, constant thunder in the east, a sound of impending liberation that instead heralded a new nightmare.
On January 27, 1945, with Soviet tanks less than 50 miles from Stalag Luft III, the German guards gave the order to evacuate. Before dawn, in a raging blizzard and temperatures of 15 below zero, Eugene Moran and nearly 10,000 other Allied airmen were forced onto the roads. Each man had what he could carry: a blanket, a few hidden scraps of food. There were no rations issued, no planned destinations, only the barked command to march west, away from the advancing Red Army. The column, a shuffling river of misery in the snow, stretched for miles. Guards on bicycles and in horse-drawn carts flanked them, their threats clear. Anyone who fell behind or tried to escape would be shot. Moran, his body still bearing the deformities of his crash, wrapped his thin blanket around his shoulders and began to walk. The initial adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by the burning ache in his malnourished legs and the sharp, familiar pain in his twisted arms. The first day was a blur of frozen breath and trudging feet. The first death came on the second day. A man simply sat down in a snowdrift and never got up. A guard's pistol shot cracked the icy air, a final period to the sentence. The body was left by the roadside, a grim marker for those who followed. The march became a slow, collective dissolution into animal instinct. Days blurred into weeks. They slept in frozen fields, barns overflowing with dysentery-ridden men, or under the open sky. Food was a memory. Sustenance came from stealing frozen turnips from fields, chewing bark, or trading a precious pen or watch with a terrified German civilian for a slice of moldy bread. Moran's feet, clad in disintegrating boots, swelled, blistered, and became infected. He could feel the pus soaking his socks, each step a fresh jolt of agony. Around him, men succumbed to frostbite, their toes and fingers turning black. Others, hollow-eyed and skeletal, simply wandered off into the woods to die. The guards, themselves cold and desperate, grew more erratic. Escape attempts, when they occurred, were usually met with a burst of machine gun fire. Yet within this abyss, glimmers of a stubborn humanity survived. Stronger prisoners supported the weak, sharing the burden of carrying those who could no longer walk. Whispered rumors of the Allied advance, passed down the column, became a secular prayer. After 57 days and nearly 600 kilometers, the shattered remnants of the column were herded into an abandoned brick factory in the town of Bitterfeld. They were not fed. They were not cared for. They were left, locked in the freezing, filthy building as the sounds of war, now the distinctive report of American artillery, grew deafeningly close. The march had ended not in liberation, but in a final silent holding pen where men lay down to die. For Moran, surviving the fall from 20,000 feet now seemed a cruel prelude to a slower, more intimate death in the dark.
The doors of the Bitterfeld factory did not open with a heroic crash, but with a hesitant, grinding screech. On April 11, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 104th Infantry Division, having fought through the town, found the building suspected of holding prisoners. What they discovered inside stopped them cold. The stench, a thick, palpable miasma of gangrene, dysentery, and death, hit them first. Then their eyes adjusted to the gloom, revealing a scene from a medieval plague pit. Hundreds of skeletal figures, more wraiths than men, lay motionless on the filthy concrete. Many were too weak to even lift their heads toward the light. For Sergeant Eugene Moran, the sound of American voices was a distant dream, fading in and out of his fevered consciousness. His world had shrunk to the small patch of floor where he lay, his gangrenous feet a source of unending throbbing agony, his weight a mere 95 pounds. A young medic, his face pale beneath his helmet, moved through the shadows, checking pulses.
When he reached Moran, his professional composure cracked for a second. Gently, he called for a stretcher. Moran felt strong hands lift him, a sensation forgotten after months of degradation. As he was carried into the piercing spring sunlight, he saw not just the grim faces of his liberators, but the green fields beyond the factory, a color so vibrant it hurt his eyes. The war was not over, but his long private war for survival had reached its turning point. He was saved, but from the abyss he now faced, the monumental climb back to life. The field hospital was a whirlwind of antiseptic, pain, and overwhelming kindness. Army surgeons battling to save men on the brink made the critical decision to fight for Moran's blackened feet rather than amputate. They flooded his system with newly abundant penicillin and sulfa drugs, cleaned his wounds, and fed him nutrients through tubes. The road to recovery was a tortuous journey in itself, measured in regained pounds and small, painful movements. By July, he was stable enough to be shipped home. The hospital ship's journey across the Atlantic was a world away from the troop transport that had carried him to war. On the morning of July 11, 1945, he was helped onto the deck. And there she was, the Statue of Liberty, standing green and magnificent in the New York harbor. The hardened soldiers and broken prisoners around him, men who had faced down cannons and survived camps, broke down in tears. For Moran, the flood of emotion was a paradox. Profound relief welded to a crushing grief for the 8 crewmates of the Ticki Tavi who would never see this sight. He was a 21-year-old man who had lived a century of horror, coming home with a body permanently twisted by a 4-mile fall and a soul forever marked by the darkness he had witnessed and the unexpected kindness he had received from enemies and strangers alike.
Home in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, was a sanctuary of familiar sounds and smells that felt a world away from the flak-filled skies over Bremen and the frozen barns of the Death March. Yet, for Eugene Moran, the war never truly ended. It merely changed its form. The physical reminders were constant, the awkward, twisted angles of his forearms that made simple farm work a daily puzzle of pain, the deep, aching throb in his feet when the weather turned cold, the scars that mapped his survival across his skin. The invisible wounds ran deeper. The sound of a low-flying crop duster could send him into a cold sweat, his mind catapulted back to the screaming descent of the tail section. He rarely spoke of the war, not to his new wife, Helen, not to the 9 children they would raise. The memories of his dead crew, the faces of the Serbian doctors, and the hollow eyes of men left in the snow were locked away in a private vault. He worked construction, tended the family farm, and built a quiet, steadfast life, a monument to normalcy erected over a foundation of profound trauma. For decades, his incredible story was known only to a few, a yellowing, dramatic entry in a unit history, a tale told in whispers among veterans. The farm boy who fell 4 miles and walked out of a German winter lived his life as a testament to a simple, powerful philosophy: endure, provide, love. The medals, the Purple Hearts, the Air Medal, were stored in a drawer, not displayed. His heroism was not in the telling, but in the quiet act of living each day, despite the weight he carried. The story, however, refused to stay buried. In the 2000s, the diligent work of historians and researchers began to piece together the fragmented accounts of that fateful November day. John Armbruster, a historian, tracked down the aging veteran in Wisconsin. Through interviews, a forgotten narrative emerged with stunning clarity: the dogfight, the severed tail, the glide, the Serbian doctors, the march. Armbruster's research connected with that of German historians who had located the crash site in the forest near Geisy.
In a profound twist of fate and reconciliation, decades after the war, Moran's children were invited to Germany for a ceremony. On the 75th anniversary of the crash, November 29, 2018, they stood in the very pine forest where their father had crashed. They met local Germans who, as children, had witnessed the falling tail section. Most unexpectedly, they shook hands with the grandson of one of the Serbian doctors who had saved Moran's life. A memorial plaque was unveiled, honoring the entire crew of the Ticki Tavi. The circle was closed. Eugene Moran passed away in 2014, but his legacy was resurrected not as a tale of violent glory, but as an enduring lesson in resilience, improbable survival, and the unexpected threads of humanity that connect us even in the darkest hours. His journey from the tail turret at 20,000 feet to a quiet street named in his honor in Soldiers Grove proves that some stories of courage are not written in the moment of explosion, but in the lifetime of peace that follows.